He walked into that building with 15 years of experience in his hands and a mop application in his pocket. And nobody in that lobby had any idea they were looking at the most overqualified janitor in California. If you've ever had to start over from nothing after giving everything you had, this story is going to hit different. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens inside Argent Holdings is the kind of thing most people never see coming. The letter came on a Thursday. Rowan Hale had been a maintenance supervisor long enough to know when something in a system was about to fail. The slight vibration in a motor running too hot, the hairline fracture in a load-bearing joint that nobody else noticed until it became a problem. He could read the signs in machinery the way some people read weather, but he hadn't read the signs in the company he'd given 15 years of his life to, and that failure sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow. He read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen counter in the gray morning light, still in the clothes he'd slept in. The language was careful and impersonal, the kind of writing that had been reviewed by legal before it ever touched paper. Organizational restructuring. Workforce optimization. We deeply value your contributions. He put the letter down on the counter next to his coffee mug and stood there for a minute without moving. Then he poured the coffee into the sink, rinsed the mug, and set it in the drying rack. That was Rowan. He didn't throw things. He didn't yell. He just moved on to the next task, because there was always a next task, and standing still didn't fix anything. The company was Daltrey Facilities Group, a mid-sized operation out of Sacramento that managed building maintenance contracts for commercial properties across Northern California. Rowan had started there at 31 as a junior technician, back when he still wore his father's old work belt and had to look up half the HVAC codes he needed. He'd learned fast, worked harder than most people thought was reasonable, and built a team of 11 people he was genuinely proud of. He'd turned around 2 underperforming sites in a single quarter. He'd saved the company close to $400,000 over 2 years by catching a systemic issue in their HVAC vendor contracts that nobody had bothered to audit. He'd done all of this without making noise about it, because that was also Rowan. He did the work and expected the work to speak. It didn't speak loud enough, apparently. The downsizing was real. He knew that much. Half the management layer had been cut. Daltrey had lost 3 major contracts in the same fiscal year, and the numbers stopped working. Nobody was lying to him about that. But knowing the reason didn't make the thing less true, and the thing was, at 46 years old, Rowan Hale was starting over. The first few weeks were uncomfortable in a way he didn't have words for. He sent out applications, real ones, careful ones, tailored cover letters, and updated portfolios of projects he'd overseen. He knew his resume was solid. The problem was that the market for senior facilities management positions didn't move fast. Companies with those roles were cautious. They took months to hire. And Rowan had a mortgage, a truck that needed new rear brakes, and a father in a small rental house in Fresno who wasn't getting any younger. He'd been supporting Elias partially for the past 3 years. Nothing dramatic, just helping cover the utilities and a portion of the rent, the kind of quiet arrangement they'd never discussed directly, but both understood. His father had worked manual labor his whole life and had the hands to show for it. The pension was modest. Rowan had never resented any of it, but the math was changing. His savings were enough to cover 4 months comfortably, maybe 5 if he cut things carefully. After that, things got uncertain. He didn't panic. Panicking wasn't in his nature. But he started looking at the numbers the way he looked at aging equipment. Honestly, without the comfort of pretending the problem wasn't there. By the second month, he widened his search. He started applying for positions he was overqualified for. Not because he wanted to, nobody wants to, but because he understood that pride was a luxury and rent was not. He applied for building superintendent positions, facility technician roles, site manager jobs at properties half the scale he'd managed before. He dressed the applications up the best he could without being dishonest, cut back on the parts of his resume that might intimidate hiring managers at smaller operations, and waited. He got a few callbacks. 2 interviews that went nowhere. Both times, he could feel the interviewer's hesitation, that unspoken calculation happening across the table. He's going to leave as soon as something better comes along. They weren't entirely wrong to wonder, but they also didn't give him the chance to say that what he needed right now wasn't prestige. What he needed was work. One afternoon in the third month, sitting at his kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and a list of open positions he'd pulled from 3 different job boards, Rowan came across a listing for a janitorial position at a property called Argent Holdings. The pay was modest. The duties were straightforward: building cleaning, trash removal, minor maintenance coordination. Below his experience by a significant margin. He stared at it for a while. Then he thought about the brakes on his truck. He thought about his father's utilities. He thought about a crack he'd noticed in his bathroom ceiling last week that was going to need attention. He clicked apply. The application was a standard form: contact information, employment history, references. There was a section near the bottom asking for any additional skills or certifications relevant to the position. Rowan sat back for a moment and thought about what to put there. He had HVAC certifications, EPA 608, OCHA 30, electrical maintenance credentials he'd kept current for years, a project management certification he'd gotten on his own time because he believed in knowing the full scope of the work. He had 15 years of documented experience overseeing complex building systems, managing teams, and cutting costs without cutting corners. He listed some of it, not all of it. No point in writing a novel for a custodial application, but he gave honest answers because that was the only kind he knew how to give. He listed his full name, his real work history, his actual certifications. Then he submitted the form and closed the laptop. He didn't think much about it after that. It was one application among 40-something. He figured he probably wouldn't hear back, or if he did, it would be a form letter. He made dinner, called his father to check in, and went to bed early. He didn't know that his name, his full name, Rowan Elias Hale, was going to land on a very specific desk and stop a very specific person cold. Argent Holdings occupied the top 4 floors of a building in downtown San Francisco's financial district, a glass and steel tower that managed commercial real estate assets up and down the California coast. It was a significant operation, several thousand managed properties, a team of nearly 300 employees, and a reputation in the industry for being exceptionally well run. The kind of company that had its processes dialed in, that didn't make frivolous decisions, that moved deliberately and expected results. The person at the top of it was a woman named Maris Eloan. She'd built Argent over 22 years, starting from a 2-person brokerage she'd run out of a rented office in Oakland with second-hand furniture and a fax machine. She was known in the industry as sharp, measured, and hard to impress. She was also known, though fewer people said this part out loud, as someone who paid close attention to things other executives treated as background noise. She read operational reports that most CEOs delegated 3 layers down. She remembered numbers. She kept notes on conversations that happened years ago. Her assistant had once described her, not unkindly, as someone who forgot nothing and forgave carefully. She reviewed hiring paperwork once a week. It was an unusual habit for someone at her level, but she'd started doing it early on when the company was small, and she'd never stopped. It wasn't micromanagement. She wasn't approving every hire. It was more like a pulse check. She liked knowing who was coming into the building. On a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Rowan submitted his application, Maris was sitting at her desk with a stack of intake forms and a cold cup of tea she'd forgotten about, working through the week's applicants with the focused efficiency she brought to most tasks. She processed them quickly. Maintenance staff, reception positions, 2 analyst candidates, a part-time facilities role. And then she turned a page, and she stopped. His name was printed clearly on the standard form in the applicant's own handwriting: Rowan Elias Hale. Maris set the page down slowly. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up again and read the full application carefully. The employment history, the certifications, the position applied for. She sat back in her chair. Outside her window, San Francisco moved in its usual way, indifferent and constant. The bay was flat and gray in the afternoon light. She looked at it for a moment, not really seeing it. Then she picked up her phone and called her assistant. "Pull the full file on the janitorial applicant," she said. "Rowan Hale, and find me a time to meet with him this week." There was a pause on the other end. The janitorial applicant? Yes. Another pause. Of course. I'll find a time. Rowan got the call on a Wednesday morning while he was in the parking lot of a hardware store, sitting in his truck with a list of things he needed but was calculating whether he could wait another week on. He almost didn't answer. Unfamiliar number. San Francisco area code, and he'd gotten 2 spam calls that week already. But something made him pick up. Is this Rowan Hale? A woman's voice, professional, measured. It is. This is Diana Park, executive assistant to Maris Eloin at Argent Holdings. We received your application and Miss Eloin would like to schedule a meeting with you. Would you be available Thursday at 2 o'clock? Rowan looked out through the windshield at nothing in particular. A meeting, he said, for the custodial position. A brief pause. Yes. She'd like to meet you personally. He almost said something about that, about the unusual nature of a CEO personally interviewing a janitor, but he stopped himself. He didn't know the company. Maybe they ran differently. Maybe it was normal there. He wasn't in a position to be particular about it. Thursday at 2 works, he said. What's the address? He wrote it on the back of his hardware store list. After he hung up, he sat in the truck for another minute. Then he started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. He wasn't sure what to make of it. He didn't try too hard to figure it out either. He'd learned a long time ago that overthinking a situation before you were inside it was mostly a way to make yourself anxious about the wrong things. He went home. He ironed his good shirt. He figured he'd find out Thursday. Well, Thursday came fast. He took the train down to San Francisco rather than drive. Parking was a headache, and he didn't need to show up distracted. He wore the good shirt, dark slacks, the leather dress shoes he kept polished out of old habit, even when he had nowhere to wear them. He looked respectable, not flashy. He'd never been flashy. The Argent Holdings lobby was the kind of space designed to communicate something without saying it directly. High ceilings, clean lines, materials that cost more than they looked like they did. The receptionist was efficient and pleasant and directed him to a waiting area with a clear view of the elevator bank. Rowan sat down, set his folder of documents on his knee, resume, certifications, a reference list he'd updated the night before, and waited. He'd been early. He was always early. At 2 o'clock exactly, Diana Park appeared from the elevator, mid-40s, organized in the way of someone who managed multiple things simultaneously and had made peace with it. She shook his hand and walked him back up to the executive floor, making brief, professional small talk about the commute and the weather, the kind of conversation that wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. They came out of the elevator into a hallway that was quieter than the floors below. Framed photography on the walls, buildings mostly, urban architecture, black and white. A set of heavy glass doors. Diana pushed one open and gestured him through. Ms. Eloin will be right in. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Water would be great, thank you. She left him in a conference room with a long table and floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the bay. He set his folder down, put his hands in his lap, and looked at the water. He'd grown up near water. His father had taken him fishing every summer at a reservoir outside Fresno when he was small. Nothing serious, just the two of them, and a cooler, and hours of not saying much. He still found something settling about the sight of it. The door opened behind him. Maris Eloin was not what he'd expected, though he hadn't let himself expect much. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, with the kind of face that had earned its lines and didn't seem bothered by them. She moved with the deliberate ease of someone who hadn't been in a hurry in years because they'd learned that rushing was mostly for other people. She was dressed simply, dark blazer, no jewelry except a watch, and she looked at him the way people look at someone when they're trying to confirm something they already half know. She extended her hand. Mr. Hale, thank you for coming in. Thank you for the invitation. He shook it. Firm grip, brief. I'll be honest, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Sit down. They both sat. She had a copy of his application in front of her, along with what looked like a printed background on Daltrey Facilities Group. Some research, he guessed, that someone had pulled for her. She didn't open it right away. She just looked at him for a moment with her hands folded on the table. Your father's name is Elias, she said. It wasn't a question. Rowan went still for just a second. That's right. Elias Hale, from Fresno. Yes. Maris looked at the application in front of her, then back at him. Something in her expression had shifted, not softened exactly, but changed, like a door opening a small amount into a room she'd kept shut for a long time. I knew your father, she said. A long time ago. She paused. More accurately, he helped me once, in a way I never properly addressed. Rowan didn't say anything. He waited, because his father had raised him to listen before he talked, and because something about the way she said it told him the story wasn't small. Maris set the application down precisely, the way she seemed to do most things. I was 26, she said, driving back from a job interview in a city I didn't know. Car broke down on the side of the road outside Fresno, late afternoon, no cell service to speak of. This was a long time ago. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know the first thing about cars. She stopped. Your father pulled over. He was in a work truck. I remember it was muddy, and he had tools in the back. He spent almost 2 hours fixing the problem. Wouldn't take any money. Said, she stopped again briefly, and something crossed her face that wasn't quite emotion but was close to it. He said he'd just want someone to do the same if his kid was ever stuck somewhere. The room was quiet for a moment. Rowan felt something shift in his chest. He knew his father. He knew exactly how that conversation would have gone. The particular matter-of-fact kindness that Elias Hale had operated by his whole life. The way he'd never seen any of it as remarkable. That sounds right, Rowan said. I looked for him afterward, Maris said. I had a first name and a general area and a description of a work truck. It wasn't enough. Life moved fast, and I didn't make it enough of a priority, and then enough time had passed that it felt... She pressed her lips together briefly. It felt like something I'd missed the window on. She looked at the application again. And then your name came across my desk, she said. And I thought, well, here we are. Rowan nodded slowly. He understood the situation now. He understood it very clearly, and with that understanding came a particular kind of discomfort, the discomfort of being in a room where the power differential was already significant, and now there was something else layered on top of it. A debt, or what felt like one. His father's kindness being called in by someone who had the means to call in nearly anything. He looked at Maris Elowen directly. I appreciate you telling me that, he said, and I appreciate the meeting, but I want to be straight with you about something. She waited. I'm not looking for a favor, he said. I applied for a custodial job because I need work, and that was what was listed. I have no expectation beyond that, and I wouldn't feel right taking something that wasn't offered because of what I can actually do. A silence. Then Maris said, Good, because I'm not in the habit of offering favors. She pulled a legal pad from beneath the folder and uncapped a pen. Tell me about the last major system failure you managed. It took Rowan a half-second to shift gears. Then he straightened slightly and started talking. He told her about the chiller unit failure at a commercial property in Roseville. Midsummer, 96 degrees, 12 tenants in the building, equipment that was 9 years past its intended service life. He told her what he'd found when he opened the system. What the vendor had told him was the problem, versus what he'd determined was actually the problem, and what he'd done about it. He told her how much it had cost, and how much it would have cost if he'd let the vendor handle it their way. Maris wrote on her legal pad. He kept talking. I didn't notice, at first, that her pen had slowed and then stopped, and that she was simply watching him, listening with the particular attention of someone who knows what they're hearing. Outside, the bay stayed flat and gray, and the city moved around them like it always did, indifferent and constant. Rowan Hale talked about the work he knew, in the plain and detailed way of a man who had spent 15 years learning it, and somewhere in that conference room, with its long table and its expensive windows, something quietly shifted. Maris had a habit she'd never told anyone about. Every evening before she left the office, she spent 10 minutes doing nothing. Not reviewing emails, not taking calls, not preparing for the next morning. Just sitting at her desk with the city visible through the glass behind her and her hands folded in her lap. Her assistant thought she was meditating. Her CFO, who'd once caught her doing it, had assumed she was waiting for a call. Neither of them had asked, and she hadn't explained. The truth was simpler and harder to articulate. She'd learned, somewhere around her early 40s, that if she didn't build silence into her day deliberately, she would run straight through it at full speed and arrive at the end of the week feeling like she'd been efficient without being present. The 10 minutes were a seam in the fabric of things, a way to make sure she was still in there somewhere, beneath the decisions and the numbers and the forward motion. That Thursday evening, after Rowan Hale left the conference room, she sat for longer than 10 minutes. She hadn't expected the conversation to go the way it did. That wasn't entirely accurate. She'd expected to be confirmed in whatever impression she'd already formed, to find him decent enough, maybe a little rough around the edges from a hard few months, grateful for the attention. What she hadn't expected was to spend 45 minutes being genuinely absorbed. He'd talked about the work the way her best people talked about their work, not to impress, but because the details mattered to him and he assumed they should matter to the person he was talking to. He'd described failure without embarrassment and success without inflation. When she'd pushed back on a few of his conclusions about vendor management, he hadn't gotten defensive. He'd thought about it for a second and then either pushed back with reasons or acknowledged the point and adjusted. That last part was rarer than people thought. Most men his age in his field had calcified around their own expertise. They'd built walls around what they knew. Rowan Hale had apparently spent 15 years building something else, a version of competence that was still curious. And then he'd walked into her building to apply for a position that paid $19 an hour. She looked at his application on the desk in front of her. The handwriting was clean and even. The certifications he'd listed were current, which meant he'd kept paying for them even after the job ended, an expense that wasn't trivial and that nobody required of him. She thought about that. She thought about his father, too, more than she expected to. The memory of that afternoon outside Fresno had dimmed over the years the way most memories do. Not gone, just lower resolution. The hot concrete of the shoulder, the smell of dry grass and exhaust, a truck pulling over that she'd half assumed would keep going, and then a man getting out, unhurried and unassuming, in a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He'd asked her what happened, and when she'd said she didn't know, he'd just nodded and gone around to the front of the car and looked. He hadn't talked much. Neither had she, partly from relief and partly because she'd been 26 and exhausted from the interview and already running calculations in her head about what a tow truck would cost. But she remembered watching him work. The economy of movement, the lack of performance, the same way the engine problem went from large and mysterious to specific and solvable right in front of her. He'd found the issue, fixed what could be fixed, told her clearly what still needed attention and where she should go to get it done. And then he'd said no when she tried to pay him and gotten back in his truck and driven away. She'd thought of him, on and off, for years. Not constantly. Just sometimes when she was in a moment of difficulty and she thought about the particular texture of unexpected help, genuine, unburdened, with no receipt attached. She'd never found him. The first name and a muddy truck and her own memory of the county road weren't much to work with. And she told herself it was the practical limits of searching, but the real truth, which she didn't examine too often, was that she'd let herself be busy. She'd always let herself be busy. It was easier than sitting in the discomfort of a debt you couldn't repay to someone you couldn't locate. Now his son had applied to mop her floors. She uncapped her pen, pulled a fresh sheet from the legal pad, and started writing. The weekend passed the way weekends did when Rowan didn't have a job, slowly, with a specific kind of restlessness that he'd learned to work against by staying physical. He fixed the crack in his bathroom ceiling on Saturday morning, mixed the compound himself, feathered the edges properly, let it dry before sanding, applied primer. He did it the right way because there was no other way he knew how to do things. He replaced the rear brake pads on the truck. He called his father Sunday afternoon and talked for half an hour about nothing much. A problem Elias was having with his water heater, a neighbor's dog that had gotten into the yard, a baseball game he'd watched on television. "You eat this week?" Elias said at some point. "I'm fine, Dad." "That's not what I asked." "Yes, I ate enough." A pause on Elias's end. Rowan could picture him perfectly, sitting in the kitchen of the small house in Fresno with the old phone cord twisted around his hand, even though he'd had a cordless for years, because some habits outlasted their reasons. "You hear anything back from that company? The big one in San Francisco?" Rowan had mentioned the Argent Holdings interview briefly, without many details. He hadn't wanted his father to make something of it before there was anything to make. "I had a meeting with them Thursday. Don't know what comes of it." "A meeting for a cleaning job?" "They run things differently, apparently." Another pause. His father had a particular silence for when he thought something didn't add up, but wasn't going to push on it. Rowan recognized this silence. "Well," Elias said, "keep me posted." "I will." "And eat." "Goodbye, Dad." He put the phone down and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dry scrub of his small backyard. He'd bought this house 7 years ago, a modest 2-bedroom in Elk Grove, nothing impressive, which was fine, because he hadn't been looking for impressive. He'd been looking for a place to keep his tools and sleep without someone else's noise through the walls. He still liked it. He was going to keep liking it if he could afford to. He went back to the brake job. Well, the call came Monday mid-morning when he was at the kitchen table with his laptop, working through another round of applications and trying not to calculate for the fourth time how long his savings would last. Diana Park again. The same measured professionalism in her voice. Ms. Elowen would like to invite you back for a second conversation this week, if you're available. Wednesday afternoon, around 3. She'd also like to include 2 other members of the leadership team. Rowan set his coffee down slowly. Other members. Our head of operations and our senior director of property services. He was quiet for a moment. None of that matched a custodial hire. None of that even came close. Ms. Park, he said carefully, can you tell me what position we're discussing? A brief pause. Ms. Elowen prefers to explain that herself, but I can tell you that it's not the janitorial role. He didn't say anything right away. He looked at the list of applications on his screen, the column of company names and positions and dates, the careful tracking of an effort he'd been making for 3 months. Okay, he said, Wednesday at 3. He closed the laptop. He didn't know how to feel about this exactly, and he didn't try to force himself to feel any particular way. He'd spent the first conversation being careful about the dynamic, the debt his father didn't know existed, the CEO who had the ability to drop something into his life out of obligation and call it an opportunity. He'd been direct about that. She hadn't flinched at it. The fact that she was bringing in other people mattered. That changed the shape of things. That meant whatever was being discussed, she wasn't trying to handle it quietly, bilaterally, as a favor. You didn't invite your head of operations and your senior director of property services to a courtesy hire. He ironed the shirt again. He polished the shoes again. Wednesday took a long time to arrive. The conference room was different this time, smaller, more working space than presentation space. A round table with 4 chairs, water glasses already filled. No view of the bay. This window faced inland, toward the city's denser blocks of commercial real estate and the midday traffic crawling through the financial district. Maris was already in the room when Diana brought him in. So were 2 other people. A man in his late 40s named Curtis Bream, introduced as head of operations, broad-shouldered with the kind of watchful steadiness of someone who'd spent years managing people who were harder to manage than they looked. And a woman named Petra Voss, senior director of property services, sharp-featured and precise, with a portfolio binder already open in front of her and a pen in her hand. Rowan shook hands with both of them and sat down. Nobody wasted time on small talk. That was something he appreciated about the room immediately. These were people who considered time carefully. Maris spoke first. I want to be clear about what this conversation is, she said. We have a position that's been open for 6 weeks. Assistant Regional Maintenance Supervisor, covering our Northern California properties. 23 buildings, a team of 14, mixed-use commercial, a couple of residential commercial blends. It's a working position. You'd be in the field regularly, not just managing from a desk. She looked at him steadily. We haven't filled it because we haven't found someone we thought could actually do it. Rowan kept his face neutral. What's the reason the previous person left? A very slight pause. Curtis and Petra exchanged a look, brief, controlled, but Rowan caught it. He was promoted, Maris said, and the position has been open 6 weeks because the pool of applicants who can handle the scope has been thin, Curtis said. His voice was direct, slightly clipped, the voice of someone who didn't soften things as a habit. We've interviewed 4 people. 2 had the technical background and couldn't manage people. 1 had strong management skills and didn't know a chiller from a cooling tower. 1 looked good on paper and fell apart in the room. Fell apart how? Rowan asked. Curtis looked at him with what might have been a slight reevaluation. Couldn't answer specific questions. Kept giving general answers about leadership philosophy when we wanted to know how he'd handled actual problems. Rowan nodded. He'd sat across from the reverse of that kind of interview himself. What are the actual problems you need this person to handle? That seemed to be the right question. Curtis leaned forward slightly. Petra's pen stopped moving. They talked for 20 minutes straight about the Northern California portfolio before anyone mentioned the role again. The Folsom Distribution Center that had been flagged twice in the past year for HVAC compliance issues. The aging electrical panel situation in 3 of their older Oakland properties. The vendor relationship with a mechanical services company that had recently started missing service windows and overbilling on labor hours. Real problems with dimensions and histories and consequences. Rowan asked questions and answered them in roughly equal measure. He didn't reach for impressive language. He talked about how he'd triaged competing priorities in a previous portfolio. Which problems you tackle immediately, regardless of cost, because the risk of inaction is higher, and which ones you schedule and document carefully so you're not making expensive decisions under pressure. He talked about the vendor overbilling issue with some specificity, because he dealt with a version of it at Daltrey, the pattern it followed, what the documentation needed to look like, where you applied pressure and where you didn't. At some point, he realized that Petra had stopped taking notes and was just watching him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "You were a senior supervisor at Daltrey for how long?" 8 years as supervisor, 7 before that as a technician and junior tech. "And you applied for a janitorial position here?" He looked at her directly. "I applied for what was listed. I needed work." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's either a very honest answer or a very disciplined one." "Probably both," he said. She wrote something down. Maris had been mostly quiet through the operational discussion, which Rowan was starting to understand was how she operated in rooms like this. She set things in motion and then watched, which was its own kind of intelligence. She spoke again now. "I want to address something directly," she said. "You made a point in our first meeting about not wanting something offered as a favor. I want you to know that's not what this is. This position was open before your application landed here. Curtis and Petra are in this room because they need to fill it and they haven't been able to, not because I brought them in for a formality." She looked at him with the same level steadiness she'd had from the first meeting. "What I did was read your application more carefully than I might have otherwise because of your name. That's the extent of the favoritism." Rowan sat with that for a moment. It was a fine line, and he wasn't sure he fully accepted it. The fact that your application gets read carefully at all is not nothing. But he also understood what she was telling him. The door was open, but he still had to walk through it under his own power, and the two people across the table from him hadn't been softened up on his behalf. Curtis, in fact, didn't look softened up at all. He looked like a man who was still making up his mind. "The Oakland electrical situation," Curtis said. "Walk me through how you'd approach the first 90 days. Rowan talked for 12 minutes without being interrupted. When he finished, Curtis sat back in his chair and looked at Maris. Something passed between them. Not words, not even an obvious look. More like a shared shift in posture. Petra closed her portfolio binder. "We have one more candidate we're scheduled to interview Friday," Maris said. "We'll be in touch early next week." Rowan nodded. "I understand." He meant it. He didn't want the position handed to him any more than he'd wanted the janitorial job handed to him. If they had a stronger candidate, they should hire that person. He stood up and shook hands with all three of them. When he shook Curtis's hand, the man held it for a second longer than necessary and looked at him with an expression that was still working something out. "One more thing," Curtis said. "That chiller situation you described in Roseville, you said you identified the actual failure point before the vendor even ran diagnostics." "That's right." "How?" Rowan thought about it for a second, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was trying to give the accurate one rather than the tidy one. "The vibration pattern was wrong," he said. "Not the loudest problem, but the one that didn't match the symptom set. Most people troubleshoot what's presenting. I usually start with what shouldn't be there at all." Curtis held eye contact for another moment. Then he nodded once, the kind of nod that isn't agreement exactly, but is a form of acknowledgement. Rowan picked up his folder, said thank you, and let Diana walk him back to the elevator. In the elevator going down, he looked at the floor numbers changing and kept his face still. He didn't want this. That was the honest version of it. Not that he didn't care, but that wanting it too much before it was his would only make the next few days harder to get through. He'd learned that lesson early, working for a man who'd talked about promotions long before they materialized, and the lesson had cost him something the first time. He stepped out into the lobby and walked through the glass doors onto the street. San Francisco was doing what it always did at midday, loud and specific, salt air and exhaust, and the kind of concrete warmth that only comes in pockets and then disappears. He walked 2 blocks to the train station with his hands in his pockets and his folder under his arm. He thought about the Folsom HVAC situation and how he would actually approach it. He couldn't help it. The following Friday passed the way waiting days pass, slowly and with texture. He fixed a fence post that had been leaning since October. He had a conversation with the HR contact at a property management company in Sacramento that went nowhere, politely. He called his father again and did not mention the Wednesday meeting because he still didn't want to make something of it. Elias talked about the water heater again. The repair estimate had come back and he didn't love the number. Send me the quote, Rowan said. Let me look at it. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. Send me the quote. A pause. You're not working right now, Ro. I have some money set aside. Send me the quote. His father made a sound that wasn't quite protest and wasn't quite gratitude, which was about as much as Elias Hale expressed of either thing. It's not urgent, he said. I just mentioned it. I know. Send it anyway. After he hung up, he stood in his kitchen for a minute, thinking about his father's hands. The way they looked now, the enlarged knuckles, the scarring across the left palm from a job site accident 20 years ago, the permanent grease line in the creases that no amount of washing had ever fully removed. His father had spent 40-odd years using his hands to fix things for other people, and he'd done it without complaint and without much recognition, and he'd somehow also done it without bitterness, which was the part Rowan had never entirely figured out. The phone rang Monday morning at 9:15. He was on his second cup of coffee and had been awake since 6 because he'd woken up early for no reason that made sense and had been unable to go back to sleep. He picked up before the second ring. It was Diana Park. Miss Eloin asked me to let you know, and I'm also calling on behalf of Curtis Bream and Petra Voss, that they'd like to offer you the Assistant Regional Maintenance Supervisor position. The formal offer letter will come through email today, but they wanted to reach you directly first. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the mug in front of him. All three of them, he said. This was a group decision. It was. He hadn't expected to feel as much as he did in that moment. It wasn't pure relief. It was more layered than that, more complicated. 3 months of the slow grind of being without work, of recalibrating what he understood about his own value in a market that wasn't responding to him. The Tuesday mornings at the kitchen table with the job board open, the phone calls that went nowhere, the interviews where he'd seen the hesitation in the other person's face. All of it had accumulated into something that he'd been managing with his jaw tight and hadn't fully let himself look at directly. Thank you, he said. Tell them I'll review the letter today. After he hung up, he sat at the table for a few minutes without doing anything. He thought about calling his father. He decided to wait until the letter came and he'd read the terms. He was careful like that. He didn't celebrate things before they were fully real, but he allowed himself for just a moment to feel the specific weight of something that had been pressing on him lifting slightly. Not gone, not finished, but moved. Shifted. The next part of the problem was different in character from the part that had just ended, and that was something. He looked at his phone, then he opened his email and waited for the offer letter. The letter came at 11:40. He read it twice, the same way he'd read the termination letter from Daltrey, carefully, without rushing, looking at the actual language rather than what he hoped it said or feared it said. The compensation was fair, not remarkable, but honest, with a clear path for review at 12 months. The scope matched what Curtis had described. The reporting structure was clear. There was a line about professional development support that he noted but didn't put too much weight on. Things like that were either real or they weren't, and you found out by working there. He accepted the same afternoon, by email, with a short and professional note that said what it needed to say without overselling his enthusiasm. I was grateful. He was ready to work. He'd see them the following Monday. He put the phone down and went outside to check on the fence post. It had settled correctly overnight. He tested the pressure, worked the gate back and forth a few times, checked the footing at the base. The job was done. He walked back inside, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and stood at the window looking out at the backyard. Then he picked up the phone and called Fresno. Elias answered on the third ring. I got a job, Rowan said. A pause. The San Francisco one? Yeah. Cleaning? No, Rowan said. Not cleaning. Assistant Regional Maintenance Supervisor, 23 properties, 14-person team. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Rowan would have checked the line if he hadn't known his father. Well, Elias said finally, yeah. That's... Another pause. That's more like it. It is. His father made that sound again, The one that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite pride, but sat somewhere between them, in the specific register of a man who felt things deeply and had never learned any words for it that satisfied him. "Come down this weekend," Elias said. "I'll make something." "You don't have to make something." "I know I don't have to. Come down anyway." Rowan looked out the window at the backyard, the dry grass, the fence post he'd just fixed standing straight again in its footing. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He had no way of knowing, and wouldn't know for months, that the woman who'd given him the opportunity was sitting in her office at that exact moment, looking at a handwritten note she'd been drafting and crossing out for the better part of a week. A note addressed not to him, but to his father. A note that was harder to write than anything she'd composed in years, because it had no business purpose and no strategy behind it, and no clear outcome. And those were the exact conditions under which Maris Eloan found herself most at a loss. She crossed out another line. Started again. Outside her window, San Francisco kept moving. The bay was a flat sheet of gray-blue under the afternoon clouds, and somewhere in the distance a container ship was making its slow way toward the port, carrying whatever it carried, patient against the current. He drove down to Fresno that Saturday. The drive was 2.5 hours depending on traffic, and Rowan had made it enough times that he didn't need the navigation. He just pointed the truck south on the 99 and let the Central Valley open up around him, the flat agricultural landscape that most people drove through without looking at, and that he'd always found settling in some way he couldn't fully explain. Maybe because it was honest country. It didn't try to be anything other than what it was: fields and irrigation channels, and the occasional water tower, the sky sitting low and pale above the valley floor in the late morning light. He stopped at a fruit stand outside Madera because his father liked the white peaches they sold there, and because it was the kind of thing Elias would never buy for himself. He put 6 in a paper bag and got back on the highway. The house in Fresno was a small rental on a quiet street that had been on the decline for the better part of a decade. Not dangerous, just tired, the kind of neighborhood where the houses were maintained out of stubbornness more than investment. Elias had lived there for 11 years since the house he and Rowan's mother had owned was sold after she died, and the math didn't work on keeping it alone. He'd never complained about the rental. He'd fixed everything that broke himself, painted the trim twice, put in a small vegetable garden along the south-facing fence that produced more tomatoes than one man could reasonably eat. Rowan pulled up and sat in the truck for a moment looking at the house. The garden was still going, a few late-season tomatoes hanging heavy on the wire supports, a row of something leafy he couldn't identify from the truck. His father had been out here recently. The ground around the plants was freshly turned. He grabbed the peaches and went to the door. Elias opened it before he knocked. He always did that. He heard the truck and came to the door, and he'd never once acknowledged doing it, just stood there in the doorway, like he'd simply happened to be there at that moment. He was 71 and looked it in some ways and didn't in others. The same broad-shouldered build that Rowan had inherited, though softer now, the muscle having shifted with age. White hair, close-cropped. The hands, always the hands, which were the biography of a man in a way his face wasn't. He looked at Rowan the way he always did, taking stock, not saying anything yet. "You look thin," he said. "I'm not thin." "Thinner." Rowan handed him the bag of peaches. Elias looked in the bag and then back at his son with an expression that was as close to approval as he regularly got. "Come in," he said. "There's food." There was food. There was always food when Rowan came. His father cooked the way he did everything else, practically and without a lot of ceremony. And the kitchen smelled like something braised and the particular warmth of a house where someone had been home all morning. They sat at the kitchen table and ate and talked about nothing critical for a while. The garden, the neighbors' ongoing war with squirrels, a documentary Elias had watched about the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge that he'd found interesting despite himself. It was only after the plates were cleared and they were sitting with coffee that Elias said, "Tell me about the job." So Rowan told him. Not everything. He left out the part about Maris Eloan and the application and the name recognition because he hadn't decided yet how to frame it, and he didn't want to tell it wrong. He told his father about the position itself, the scope, the portfolio, the team size, the problems he was walking into, the Folsom HVAC situation, the Oakland electrical issues, the vendor relationships that needed restructuring. His father listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without performing interest, just actually paying attention in that quiet, total way that Rowan had tried to learn from his whole life and had only partially succeeded at. You think you can do it? Elias said when he finished. Yes. That's a bigger portfolio than you had at Daltrey. By about 30%, yes. And a smaller team, which makes it more efficient if it's the right team. Elias turned his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table, a habit, something he did when he was thinking. They know what they're getting? Rowan thought about Curtis Bream's specific questions, Petra Voss closing her binder, the 12 minutes he'd talked about the Oakland electrical situation without being interrupted. Yeah, he said, they know. His father nodded once. The subject was apparently settled. They watched football in the afternoon. Elias had never been a devoted fan, but he watched on Saturdays the way some men do, not out of passion, but out of the comfortable ritual of it. Rowan dozed off somewhere in the second quarter and woke up to find the game had changed and his father had put a blanket on him, which neither of them mentioned. He drove back to Elk Grove in the early evening. The sky over the valley was a dark orange on the western edge, and the headlights of trucks going north and south made a moving river on the highway. He thought about Monday. He thought about what his father had asked. They know what they're getting? He hoped so. He was about to find out. The first week at Argent Holdings had the specific texture of all first weeks, the simultaneous experience of absorbing too much information and not yet having the standing to act on any of it. Rowan had been through enough starts to know that the instinct to demonstrate competence immediately was the wrong one. You watched first. You asked questions that were genuinely questions, not assertions dressed up with a rising inflection. His direct supervisor was a woman named Georgette Tam, Regional Maintenance Director for the Northern California portfolio, mid-50s, efficient in the particular way of someone who'd been doing a complex job long enough that it looked easier from the outside than it was. She had a schedule that ran 15 minutes ahead of itself and a habit of talking quickly. When she was covering ground, she found obvious and slowing down only when something was actually complicated. Rowan liked her immediately, with the specific kind of liking that is about professional respect rather than personal warmth. She walked him through the portfolio on his first day. Not a presentation, just a walkthrough of the master property list, while they sat at a work table in the operations center on the third floor of the Argent building. Spreadsheets, maintenance logs, open work orders, vendor contact lists. She gave him a tablet loaded with the property management system and showed him the reporting structure. You'll do your own site visits in weeks 1 through 3, she said. Don't try to fix anything yet, just look. The team has been operating without a supervisor for 6 weeks, and they've done fine, which means they've developed workarounds that work for them that may or may not be the best approach. You need to know what those are before you start adjusting things. Agreed, Rowan said. She looked at him sideways. Most people in this position argue with me about that. Then most people in this position take longer to become effective. She almost smiled. The Folsom site first. That's the most active issue right now. The HVAC compliance flag is 60 days from becoming a regulatory problem, and the previous report from the vendor we have on contract is, she paused, choosing her word carefully, optimistic. Optimistic how? It concludes that the system is within tolerance when I'm not sure that's accurate. Either they ran inadequate diagnostics or they're telling us what keeps the contract renewal easy. Rowan made a note. Who wrote the report? Cascade Mechanical. They've had the Northern California HVAC contract for 4 years. He wrote that down too. I'd like a copy of the original service records going back to the last major intervention, not just the most recent report. Georgette gave him another sideways look. This one's slightly different. I'll have Diana pull them. He started site visits Wednesday. He drove himself. He didn't need someone to navigate for him, and he found that driving solo gave him time to think before he arrived anywhere. The Folsom Distribution Center was a large commercial property anchored by 2 primary tenants, a regional logistics company and a light manufacturing operation, with a third smaller tenant in the eastern wing that had been there for less than a year. The building was 15 years old. The HVAC infrastructure was original to the construction, which meant it was 15 years old and had received incremental maintenance but no comprehensive overhaul. He spent 4 hours on the Folsom site. He talked to the on-site maintenance tech, a compact, experienced man named Danny Reyes, who'd been at the property for 3 years and knew every quirk of the system the way longtime techs always do. Not from documentation, but from accumulated hours of listening and watching and responding. The unit on the east side of the roof has been cycling weird since February, Danny said. They were standing on the roof in the October afternoon heat, which was still significant in Folsom, even in the fall. I wrote it up 3 times. The vendor came out twice and said it was within spec. Who signed off on that? Rowan asked. I don't know. Someone from Cascade, different guy both times. Rowan crouched next to the unit's access panel, which he'd already opened. He wasn't running diagnostics yet. Georgette was right that this week was for looking, but he could see enough without instruments to have concerns. There was scoring on the contactor that was inconsistent with normal wear pattern. The refrigerant lines had fittings that showed signs of repeated access, more recent than the service records would account for. He stood up and looked at Danny. When was the last time someone checked the charge level? Danny frowned. They checked it in the last service visit. It's in the report. I know it's in the report, Rowan said. I'm asking when someone actually checked it. A pause. Danny looked at the unit. I mean, the vendor. Okay, Rowan said, which wasn't agreement, just acknowledgement that he'd heard the answer and it was the answer he'd expected. He took 3 photos of the contactor, scoring with his phone, and made a note on the tablet. I'm going to want to be here when we run independent diagnostics on this one, before we engage Cascade again. Danny looked at him steadily. You think they're not checking it? I think the report says they checked it. I want to see what the numbers look like when someone else checks it. Danny nodded slowly, the nod of a man who'd had the same suspicion and hadn't had the standing to do anything about it. All right, he said. I'll make sure I'm here. The second site visit, in Oakland, was a different kind of problem. There were 3 Argent properties in Oakland within 6 blocks of each other, 2 office buildings and a mixed-use residential commercial structure, all acquired in the same portfolio purchase 7 years earlier. The electrical panels in all 3 had been flagged in a facilities audit 8 months prior. The recommended action in the audit was phased upgrades over 18 months. The first upgrade had been completed on schedule. The second had stalled. Rowan met the Oakland area tech, a younger woman named Sophia Fan, who was 29 and had been doing this work for 6 years and had an impatient, compressed energy that he recognized as the particular frustration of someone who knows what needs to be done and can't get approval to do it. She showed him the panel in the second building without much preamble, unlocked the utility room, opened the panel box, and stood back. He looked at it. He looked for a while. Who approved the delay on the second upgrade? He asked. There was a budget review in July and non-urgent items got pushed. She said it with the careful flatness of someone who has a strong opinion and has learned to present it without the opinion. Who classified this as non-urgent? A pause. I don't know exactly. It came down from above the property level. Who's above the property level on a capital decision like this? Regional, which meant Georgette's predecessor, or Georgette herself. He didn't say that. How old is this wiring? The panel was last fully replaced in 2009. The wiring in the east wing is original to the building. He looked at the wiring. He looked at the load indicators. He thought about the 200 and something people who occupied this building on a normal workday. This isn't non-urgent, he said. No, Sophia said, it's not. He took extensive photos. He pulled the load data going back 2 years on his tablet and stood in the utility room reading it with Sophia beside him, and she didn't hurry him and didn't try to explain what he was reading. She just waited, which told him she'd learned something about patience despite the compressed energy, and that she trusted the data to speak without her having to narrate it. Okay, he said when he was done. I'm going to put this on paper and it's going to say what it needs to say, not what's convenient. Sophia looked at him with something that was cautious, but was also the beginning of something like relief. Is that going to create problems for you? Probably some, he said. That's fine. By the end of his 3rd week, Rowan had visited 17 of the 23 properties. He had a tablet full of notes, a phone full of photos, and a clear picture that was both better and worse than the documents had suggested. Better in that the team was more capable than 6 weeks of leaderless operation might have indicated. The individual techs were, by and large, experienced and honest, and had been doing their best. Worse in that several deferred maintenance issues had been deferred long enough to become something beyond routine, and at least one vendor relationship had the specific shape of a problem that had been allowed to grow because addressing it would have required a difficult conversation. He wrote his first formal report on a Sunday afternoon at his kitchen table, which was where he wrote things that required full attention. He spent 4 hours on it. He was careful to separate observation from conclusion from recommendation, because he'd learned early that mixing those three things was how you wrote a report that nobody trusted. Observation was what he saw. Conclusion was what it meant. Recommendation was what to do about it. You had to earn each one separately, or you had nothing. He sent it to Georgette Monday morning with a note that was straightforward. "This is what I found. Happy to discuss any of it." She called him at 10:15. "The Cascade section," she said. "Yes." "You're saying their reports on Folsom are inaccurate." "I'm saying the physical evidence at the site is inconsistent with the conclusions in the reports. I'd like to run independent diagnostics before I say anything stronger than that." A pause. "Cascade has had this contract for 4 years. They're not a small company. This is going to be a significant thing to put on paper." "I know," he said. "I also think the Folsom unit is heading toward a failure event, and when it fails, the documentation is going to show that we were told 3 times by the site tech that something was wrong, and the response was 2 vendor visits that concluded everything was fine." Silence on the other end. "Give me until Wednesday," Georgette said. "I need to loop in Petra before we do anything with Cascade." "That's reasonable." "And the Oakland Electrical? I'm escalating that myself today. That one doesn't need more review." "Good," he said. He put the phone down and looked at the surface of his kitchen table for a moment. He hadn't slept particularly well the night before. Not anxiety exactly, more the particular wakefulness of someone who is holding a lot of information and hasn't yet put it in its final order. He'd lain in the dark at 4 in the morning going through property numbers in his head like a checklist. He got up and poured himself more coffee. Wednesday came and went. Georgette looped in Petra Voss, who had read the full report by Tuesday afternoon and had flagged the Cascade section with comments that were brief and pointed. By Thursday afternoon, Rowan was sitting in a conference room with Georgette and Petra and Curtis Bream, who had apparently requested to be included once Petra briefed him. It was a tighter meeting than the interview had been. The operational stakes were real and present in the room. Curtis was looking at the section of the report dealing with Cascade. He read with the focused intensity of someone for whom documents are tools, not theater. "You're recommending an independent assessment before the contract renewal discussion," he said, without looking up. "Yes," Rowan said. "I want to know what the unit in Folsom actually shows when someone who doesn't have a financial interest in the answer runs the diagnostics. If the numbers match what Cascade reported, I'll say so. And if they don't, then we have a different conversation with Cascade." Curtis set the report down and looked at him. "This is going to be uncomfortable. They've been a vendor partner for 4 years. There are people in this building who have working relationships with their account team." "I understand that," Rowan said. "But if the unit fails in January during peak load and we trace it back to a series of inaccurate service reports, that's more uncomfortable." Curtis looked at Petra. Petra said, "He's right." Curtis looked back at Rowan with the expression he seemed to keep in a separate drawer from his other expressions, calibrated, considering, the look of a man deciding something by looking at another man rather than at a document. "Okay," Curtis said. "Do the independent assessment. Document everything. I want the full paper trail." "Already building it," Rowan said. He left that meeting with something he didn't try to name but was aware of. A sense of being in the right place, doing the right kind of work, which is not the same as things going well, but is its own form of traction. He wasn't naive enough to think the Cascade situation would resolve cleanly. These things rarely did. There would be pushback. There would be conversations he didn't look forward to. There would probably be a moment where someone in a financial relationship with Cascade said something to Georgette or Curtis about the new supervisor who'd been there 3 weeks and was already turning over rocks. He was okay with that. He turned over the rocks because the rocks needed turning. That was the job. The independent assessment of the Folsom HVAC unit happened the following Monday. Rowan hired a firm called Pacific Technical Services that he'd worked with once before at Daltrey, a small outfit, independent, no overlapping contracts with Argent's current vendor pool, which was a condition he'd specified. The technician they sent was a taciturn man named Marcus, who had the methodical precision of someone who had stopped being impressed by anything about 15 years ago and had arrived at a kind of pure professionalism on the other side. Danny Reyes was there, as promised. He watched Marcus run the diagnostics with the focused attention of a man watching his own suspicions get measured. The refrigerant charge was off. Not catastrophically, not yet, but measurably, significantly, in a way that should have shown up in the last two service reports and didn't. The contactor scoring that Rowan had noticed on his first visit was, in Marcus's measured professional opinion, indicative of ongoing elevated cycling stress consistent with a low-charge condition over several months. Someone checked this and said it was fine, Marcus said, not accusatorially, but in the tone of a man stating a fact that he found straightforwardly confusing. That's what the report says, Rowan said. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a word and documented his findings on his own tablet in a way that was thorough and specific and would hold up to any review. He handed Rowan a preliminary summary before he left the site. Danny waited until Marcus's truck pulled out of the parking lot and then looked at Rowan. Now what? He said. Now I write it up, Rowan said, and we get the unit serviced correctly before the temperature drops, and everyone in that logistics warehouse discovers it the hard way. He drove back to San Francisco with the preliminary report on the passenger seat and the specific clarity of someone who had asked a question and gotten an unpleasant but definitive answer. He didn't take pleasure in being right about Cascade. Being right about that meant someone had been cutting corners on a system that 60-some people depended on every working day, and that was not a satisfying thing to have confirmed. But he documented it fully. He documented it because documentation was the only thing that turned a problem into a solvable problem instead of a recurring one. He sent the report to Georgette that evening with a note. Preliminary findings attached. Recommend we schedule the Cascade conversation this week. Also recommend immediate corrective service on the Folsom unit, which I can coordinate with Pacific Technical. Georgette's response came at 9:40 that night, which told him she'd read it the same evening. Agreed on both. I'll set up the Cascade meeting. You're not in that one. I'll handle it with Petra. Focus on getting Folsom serviced. He appreciated the clarity of that. Georgette was drawing a clear line between his lane and hers, which was appropriate. The vendor relationship was above his pay grade, as it should be. His job was the technical documentation. Hers was the business consequence. He set up the corrective service for Thursday. It was Petra who stopped by his workspace on Friday afternoon, a shared open-plan area on the third floor where he'd claimed a corner desk that had good sight lines to the operations board and was close enough to the coffee machine to be practical. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without asking, which he'd already learned was how she operated. She treated spaces as functional rather than territorial. Cascade, she said. How'd it go? Better and worse than expected, she paused. They didn't dispute the findings. Their account manager actually... She stopped and something crossed her face that was close to tiredness. He said the technician who wrote those reports was no longer with the company, which could be true. Or convenient, Rowan said. Or convenient. We're putting the renewal on hold pending a full audit of their work across all our sites. That's going to take a few months and it's not going to be a fun process. Rowan nodded. He'd expected something like that. Petra was looking at him with the same quality of attention she'd had in his interview, assessing, but not unfriendly. Curtis wants to know how the rest of the portfolio looks, she said. Not formally. He just asked me to mention it. Tell him I'll have a comprehensive picture by end of month. There are some other things that need attention, but nothing that rises to the Folsom level. That's what you found in 3 weeks. I had good site techs. They knew where the problems were. They just needed someone to write it up. Petra was quiet for a moment. Danny Reyes at Folsom, she said. He wrote up the cycling issue 3 times. I know. He's been at that site for 3 years and never had much traction getting things addressed. Rowan looked at her. I'm aware. I talked to him about it. What'd you tell him? That if he writes it up, I read it, and if I read it and it holds up, I escalate it. He paused. That's the job. Petra held his gaze for a second. Yes, she said. That's the job. She stood up with the same efficiency she'd sat down with, picked up the folder she'd brought, and walked back toward the elevator. Rowan turned back to his screen. The Folsom unit had been serviced Thursday and was running correctly. The Oakland electrical upgrade had been formally reprioritized, and a contractor was scheduled for the following month. His report on the broader portfolio was about 70% drafted. His team of 14, distributed across the Northern California sites, had begun to understand, in the particular way that teams pick up on things without being explicitly told, that their new supervisor read what they wrote and showed up when he said he'd show up. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of progress that had any one moment you could point to. It was just the slow accumulation of showing up and doing the work correctly, which was the only kind of progress Rowan had ever fully trusted. He worked until 6:30, which was later than he'd intended, but earlier than he'd expected. He shut down the tablet, put on his jacket, and took the elevator down to the lobby. Outside, the financial district was doing the end of Friday thing, people moving faster, lighter, the particular current of a city releasing the weak. He walked to the train station with his hands in his pockets. He was tired in the productive way, not the defeated way, and there was a version of the difference between those two things that he thought he might never stop being grateful for. His phone buzzed on the walk. A text from his father. "How's the week?" Not a question. Elias never punctuated texts as questions, just as statements with the expectation that you'd understand them. Rowan typed back while he walked. Good. Long. Getting somewhere. 3 dots appeared. Then, good. Then, after a pause, peaches were good. Rowan smiled at his phone. Not a big smile, just the particular kind you get from something small that is also exactly right, and put it in his pocket and kept walking. The Cascade audit took 11 weeks. Rowan wasn't directly involved in most of it. That was Petra's operation, run with the methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, but he felt it in the background of his days the way you feel a slow-moving weather system. Vendor relationships at the property level were tense in a specific way that experienced techs recognized immediately. When a major contract was under review, the on-site service visits got more careful, the response times improved, and the technicians who showed up started leaving more complete paperwork. It was the behavior of a company that had been told someone was paying attention. Rowan paid attention regardless, which was the point. By November, he had completed his assessment of all 23 properties and delivered a comprehensive report to Georgette that ran to 41 pages, not counting appendices. He'd written it the same way he wrote everything, organized by urgency, clear about what was observation and what was conclusion, specific about costs and timelines. He'd been at Argent Holdings for 7 weeks. Georgette read the full report over a weekend and came in Monday morning with 2 pages of handwritten notes and a look on her face that was hard to read until she sat down across from him and said, "This is the most thorough first quarter assessment I've received from anyone in this position." "Thank you," he said. "That's not entirely a compliment. The previous 2 supervisors produced reports that were correct in what they said and incomplete in what they didn't say. This one says things. Is that a problem?" She thought about it with the brevity of someone who's already thought about it. "No, it means more work in the short term. It also means we're not going to be surprised by anything in this portfolio for the next 2 years, which is worth more than the work." She tapped the pages. "The Sacramento cluster. I want to talk through your recommendation on the roof membrane situation." They talked for an hour and a half. It was a working conversation, not a performance of one, and by the end of it, Rowan had a clearer sense of how Georgette's mind operated under pressure. She was conservative with capital decisions and aggressive with anything that touched compliance or liability. That was a consistent internal logic, and consistent internal logic in a supervisor made Rowan's job easier because he knew what standard he was writing toward. He went back to his desk with 3 action items and the quiet satisfaction of a meeting that had accomplished what it was supposed to. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Georgette had forwarded a copy of his report to Curtis Bream the same morning she received it, with a single line above the attachment. "Read the Folsom section and the Oakland addendum." Curtis had read both sections that afternoon. He'd printed the Oakland addendum and made his own handwritten notes in the margins, and then put it in a folder in his desk drawer, which was where he kept things he was still thinking about. December arrived in the way it always did in San Francisco. Not with cold exactly, more with a quality of damp and gray that settled into everything and made the mornings slower. Rowan had developed a routine by then, which helped. He was up at 5:45 at his desk by 7:15, in the field at least 2 days a week. He'd learned which tenants at which properties were the kind to call for small things, and which ones went quiet until something was genuinely wrong. The second type always concerned him more. He'd instituted a simple change in the site tech reporting process. One paragraph written update every Friday from each site, sent directly to him. No template, just what happened that week and what they were watching. It took each tech maybe 15 minutes, and it had already caught 2 developing issues that would have grown into larger ones if they'd waited for the quarterly review cycle to surface them. Danny Reyes had sent his first Friday update with a note at the bottom. I've been here 3 years, and this is the first time anyone's asked me to write these. Thank you. Rowan had read it, noted the 2 things Danny was watching, and responded with a question about one of them that required a specific answer. He hadn't responded to the thank you part, because what was there to say? You're welcome for asking you to do your job? The structure should have existed before he got there. He wasn't proud of establishing something that was basic. He was just doing it. But he thought about Danny's note sometimes, about the 3 years of writing up problems and not getting much traction, about the particular experience of doing your job correctly and having it disappear into a system that wasn't paying attention. He understood it more than he'd have liked to. The situation with Marcus Teal came up in the second week of December, and it was the first genuinely difficult personnel situation Rowan had faced at Argent. Marcus Teal, not the same Marcus as Pacific Technical, a coincidence that had confused Rowan briefly in the early weeks. 14 techs on his team, based at 2 adjacent commercial properties in Walnut Creek. He was 44, had been with Argent for 6 years, and had a skill set that the records described as solid, and that the other techs, when it came up obliquely in conversation, described with a particular kind of careful neutrality that told Rowan more than enthusiasm would have. The problem revealed itself in stages. First, it was a missed service window, a routine HVAC filter change that Teal had logged as completed on a Thursday when the property manager at Walnut Creek reported the filters hadn't been touched. Rowan had caught it in the weekly update discrepancy and addressed it directly. He'd called Teal, described the discrepancy, and asked for an explanation. Teal had said the property manager was wrong, that he'd done the work. Rowan had gone to the site himself the following Tuesday, not to catch anyone, just to look. The filters were overdue. The dust accumulation pattern didn't match a recent change. He'd documented it and scheduled a formal check-in with Teal for the following week. Not a disciplinary meeting, a conversation, because one discrepancy didn't make a pattern, and Rowan wasn't in the business of treating people as problems until they demonstrated that's what they were. He'd given Teal the chance to explain, and the explanation hadn't held up to the physical evidence, and now they needed to talk about that. Teal came into the meeting defensive, in the particular way of someone who already knows they're caught, but hasn't decided how to handle it. I want to talk about Walnut Creek, Rowan said. He kept his voice level and didn't perform anything. No disappointment, no pressure, just the subject on the table. I did that work, Teal said. His jaw was set. Okay, Rowan said. I was out there Tuesday. The filters in the East HVAC bank hadn't been changed recently. The accumulation pattern could mean anything, Teal said. Different tenant activity, different air quality on that side of the building. Marcus, Rowan said. Teal stopped. I'm not here to build a case against you, Rowan said. I'm here because there's a discrepancy in the documentation, and I need to understand what happened. If there's something going on that made it hard to get to the site that week, tell me and we can talk about it. If the schedule is unmanageable, tell me that too. What I can't do is work with documentation that doesn't match physical reality, because when something breaks and someone asks me why we didn't catch it, that documentation is the only thing standing between this team and a very difficult conversation. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight in it. Teal looked at the table. He was a man who'd been doing this work for a long time and had developed somewhere along the way the habit of cutting corners in ways that were small enough to mostly go unnoticed, and that had therefore continued. It wasn't malice. It was the slow erosion of someone who'd stopped being held to a consistent standard and had adjusted accordingly. Rowan had seen it before. He didn't find it simple to deal with, and he didn't pretend to. The schedule is tight, Teal said finally. His voice had dropped. Tell me specifically. Teal talked for 10 minutes about the 2 Walnut Creek properties. The call volume from one tenant in particular, the response time expectations that didn't leave room for preventive maintenance without running over into logged hours that he'd been told to keep in range. It was a real problem inside a larger problem, and Rowan listened to all of it without interrupting. Okay, Rowan said when he finished. I believe the schedule is tight. I'm going to look at the workload allocation for those two sites and see if it's reasonable. If it's not, I'll adjust it." He paused. "But the documentation has to be accurate. Whatever the actual constraint is, the log has to reflect what actually happened, not what was supposed to happen. Do you understand why?" Teal looked up. "Yeah," he said. "I understand. If the log says work was done and it wasn't, and then something fails that the maintenance was supposed to prevent, that's not just a paperwork issue. That's a liability issue. It follows you and it follows this team." A pause. "I know. I'm going to do a follow-up site visit at Walnut Creek in 2 weeks," Rowan said, "and I'm going to audit the service logs going back 90 days. I'm not doing it to punish you. I'm doing it because I need an accurate baseline, and I don't have one yet." He looked at Teal directly. "I'd like to still have you on this team in January. I think you're capable of doing this work correctly when the conditions support it. I'm going to try to fix some of the conditions. You need to fix the documentation." Teal was quiet for a moment. "And if the audit finds other discrepancies?" Rowan didn't look away. "Then we deal with those too, one at a time." Teal left the meeting without saying much else, and Rowan sat at the table for a few minutes after he was gone. He didn't feel good about it. He never felt good about these conversations. Anyone who claimed to didn't understand what was actually at stake in them. You were telling someone that the way they'd been operating wasn't going to work anymore, and that was true and necessary, and also genuinely hard for the person on the other end of it, regardless of their culpability. He pulled up the Walnut Creek workload allocation on his tablet and started actually looking at the numbers. What he found over the next 2 hours was that Teal had not been lying about the schedule. The two properties had a combined service requirement that, on paper, was manageable for one technician and in practice was not, particularly given one tenant's tendency to generate service calls at a rate that ran about 40% higher than the original estimate. The preventive maintenance windows were being squeezed by reactive call volume, which was a systemic problem, not a personal failing. He adjusted the allocation. He moved one of the Walnut Creek properties to a shared responsibility between Teal and a tech in the adjacent zone who had capacity. He documented his reasoning. Then he wrote up the Teal situation in his HR file with the specificity and even-handedness it required. The discrepancy, the conversation, the mitigating factor of the schedule, the corrective actions taken by both parties. He wasn't covering for Teal. He wasn't prosecuting him either. He was writing down what had actually happened so that whoever looked at it next would have the full picture. That was the discipline of it. You wrote it down accurately whether it was comfortable or not. The Walnut Creek audit found 2 additional documentation discrepancies in the 90-day window. Both were minor. Rowan addressed them in a follow-up conversation with Teal that was shorter and quieter than the first. The schedule adjustment had already taken effect, and Teal, to his credit, seemed to have made a decision about which direction he was going to go. The 2 weeks following the meeting showed accurate logs, completed work orders, and one proactive note about a condensate drain at the smaller property that Teal had flagged and addressed before it became a call. That last part mattered. Anyone could comply under scrutiny. The condensate drain note was something different. It was the behavior of a tech who was paying attention again, who'd remembered that the job had a point beyond the paperwork. Rowan noted it and moved on. He didn't make a thing of it with Teal because Teal didn't need a gold star for doing his job correctly. He needed a sustainable environment to do it in, and that was what Rowan had tried to build. Whether he'd succeeded, only time would show. January brought the Cascade resolution. Petra walked Rowan through it on a Thursday morning in her office, which was smaller than he'd expected for a senior director, efficiently arranged, a single plant on the windowsill that was thriving in defiance of the gray winter light, file binders organized with the precision of someone who'd stopped relying on digital search when physical organization was faster. "We audited 18 months of Cascade service records across all Northern California sites," she said. "Found documentation inconsistencies on 4 properties in addition to Folsom. Nothing as significant as Folsom, but a pattern." "What's their explanation?" "Personnel turnover in their field team," which may be partially true. She paused with the same careful honesty she'd shown in his interview. "We've decided not to renew the contract. We're going to tender competitive bids for the HVAC maintenance work and run a proper evaluation process." Rowan nodded. "Timeline?" New contract in place by April 1st. You'll be involved in the evaluation. I want your technical input on the bid assessments. Okay. She looked at him for a moment. This started because you spent 4 hours on a roof in Folsom and noticed that the contactor scoring didn't match the service record. It started because Danny Reyes wrote it up 3 times, Rowan said. Petra considered that. Fair. I just had the standing to do something about it. Also fair, she said, but having the standing and using it are different things. He didn't argue with that. He left her office and went back to his desk and opened the bid tender template Georgette had sent him, and he started working through the technical criteria section with the specificity the situation required. The 12-month review arrived faster than it should have, the way time moves when work fills it properly. It was a Tuesday in March, almost exactly 5 months into the role, when Georgette called him into a meeting that had been on the calendar for 2 weeks, labeled simply quarterly check-in. He'd prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, reviewed his documentation, knew his numbers, identified the areas where he thought he'd fallen short so he could address them before they became someone else's conclusion. What he hadn't expected was that Curtis Bream would be in the room. Curtis was sitting to the right of Georgette when Rowan came in, with a folder in front of him and the same calibrated expression he'd had in every interaction Rowan had had with him, watchful, non-committal, until he'd decided something, and then direct. Rowan sat down. Georgette started with the numbers. The Northern California portfolio operating costs were down 4.3% compared to the same period the prior year, which she noted was partially attributable to the Cascade contract renegotiation and partially to preventive maintenance interventions that had avoided 2 reactive repair events, one at Folsom, which everyone in the room understood, and one at a Stockton property where Sophia Fan's counterpart had flagged a roof drainage issue in a Friday update that Rowan had escalated before the winter rains arrived. Tenant satisfaction scores are up on 7 of the properties with consistent site tech coverage, she continued. 3 sites are neutral. 2 are down, both of which are in active transition situations. She went through 3 more metrics with the same even-handedness, things that had improved, things that were still in process, 2 things that hadn't worked the way he'd intended. The Friday update system had a compliance gap at 2 sites where the techs were inconsistent about sending them, which she named directly and which Rowan acknowledged he hadn't fully resolved. Then she stopped and looked at Curtis. Curtis opened his folder. He looked at Rowan with the expression that still made Rowan feel slightly like he was being tested, which he suspected was intentional. I want to talk about the Teal situation, Curtis said. Rowan kept his face neutral. He'd documented the whole thing and had no reason to expect ambush, but personnel situations and reviews were always the variable you couldn't fully control. You found a documentation discrepancy, Curtis said. You investigated it, addressed it directly with the employee, identified a systemic schedule problem that was contributing to the behavior, corrected the schedule, and followed up. The employee's performance since then has been, he glanced at the folder, acceptable, trending toward solid. Yes, Rowan said. You could have built a termination case, Curtis said. The discrepancies were documented. HR would have supported it. I know. Why didn't you? Rowan looked at him directly. Because the problem wasn't only Marcus Teal. The schedule was genuinely unmanageable. Removing him and hiring someone new into the same schedule would have produced the same result, and I'd have lost 6 years of site-specific knowledge in the process. He paused. He made a bad call and developed a bad habit because the environment let him. Change the environment, address the habit directly, see if the person adjusts. If he doesn't, then you have a termination case with clean documentation. Curtis held his gaze for a long moment. And if he'd continued after the conversation? Then I'd have built the termination case. Curtis looked at Georgette briefly. Something passed between them that Rowan didn't try to interpret. Curtis closed the folder. We're going to adjust your title, Curtis said. Effective April 1st, Regional Maintenance Supervisor. The assistant prefix is coming off. Rowan heard it. He took a moment before he said anything because he wanted to be sure his response was the right one and not a performed version of the right one. Is this tied to the Cascade outcome? He said. Curtis almost smiled. Not quite, but close. It's tied to 5 months of work product and one specific personnel situation that told us more about your judgment than your technical skills did. He paused. The Cascade outcome helped. I want to make sure the promotion is earned, Rowan said, not accelerated. It's earned, Georgette said. She said it with the brevity of someone stating a fact they've already established internally. The scope increase is real. Georgette will walk you through the additional responsibilities. There are 6 more properties coming into the Northern California portfolio in Q2. From the Hartwell acquisition? Curtis raised an eyebrow slightly. You've been following that. It came up in a trade publication, and the property types matched our existing portfolio. I thought it was probably relevant. A moment of quiet. Then Curtis said, Yes, from the Hartwell acquisition. 29 properties total by June. Rowan did the arithmetic on the team implications and didn't say it out loud, but he made a note. He called his father that evening from the parking garage under the Argent building, sitting in his truck with the engine running for the heat. Elias answered on the second ring, which was unusual. He was typically a third-ring man. Hey, Rowan said, you near the phone? I'm always near the phone. How's the water heater? Rowan, I'm getting to it. Then get to it. He told his father about the promotion. He told it plainly, without the emotional scaffold that some people would have built around it. Not because he didn't feel anything, but because Elias would find the plain version more honest and would hear it better that way. His father was quiet for a moment. A long moment. Regional supervisor, Elias said. Yes. 29 properties. By summer, yes. Another pause. Rowan could picture him in the kitchen, the coffee mug, the cord wrapped around his hand. You happy there? Elias said. It was such a specific question in such a specific moment that it caught Rowan slightly off guard. His father didn't ask that often, not because he didn't care, but because he came from a generation that treated happiness as something you found incidentally while doing work that mattered, not something you pursued directly. Rowan thought about it honestly. The Friday updates from his texts, the Folsom roof in the October afternoon, the teal conversation and the condensate drain note, the 37-page report that Georgette had called the most thorough she'd received, the specific quality of tiredness he drove home with most evenings. Yeah, he said. I am. Good, his father said. And that was that. They talked for another 10 minutes about nothing in particular. The garden, the water heater quote that Rowan had reviewed and called lowball and had referred his father to a different contractor. A book his father had gotten from the library that he'd started and wasn't sure about yet. After they hung up, Rowan sat in the truck for a moment with the parking garage concrete visible in his headlights and the San Francisco night sounds muffled by the structure around him. He thought about the day he'd sat at his kitchen table in Elk Grove and clicked apply on a janitorial listing. He thought about it with the clear-eyed honesty he tried to apply to most things. There was nothing romantic about that moment, nothing to reframe as resilience or wisdom. It had been a man running out of options and doing the practical next thing. That was all. But the practical next thing had landed him in a room with people who ran a real operation and had real problems that needed real solutions, and he'd been able to provide those, and they'd recognized it and responded accordingly. That was also all. No more and no less. He put the truck in drive and pulled out of the garage into the San Francisco night, which was doing what it always did. Its specific damp and indifferent thing, the fog already starting to come in from the bay, the streets wet and reflecting the streetlights back at themselves. He drove north toward the bridge and then east toward home, and he thought about 29 properties and what the team structure would need to look like. And he thought about Danny Reyes at Folsom and whether the Friday update system was going to hold up under expanded coverage. And he thought about the HVAC vendor evaluation process that was still ongoing and the 2 remaining bids he hadn't finished reviewing. He thought about the work, the way he always thought about the work, because the work was always the next thing, and the next thing was always there. What he didn't think about, not that evening, not yet, was the letter. Maris had finally finished it sometime in late January, after 6 weeks of drafts that she'd thrown away. She'd sent it by postal mail because email felt wrong for what it was. A letter to a man in Fresno she'd never met, written by a woman in her mid-50s who'd been carrying a 20-year-old debt she couldn't quantify and had finally decided that carrying it was worse than saying so. She didn't know whether Elias Hale would remember the afternoon she was writing about. She didn't know whether the letter would mean anything to him. She'd written it anyway because it needed to be written, and because she'd learned something in the past year about the cost of leaving things unsaid. The letter had been sitting on Elias Hale's kitchen table for 6 weeks. He hadn't told his son about it. Elias Hale had read the letter 4 times. The first time he'd read it, standing at the kitchen counter with his coat still on, having picked it up from the stack of mail without looking at the return address, expecting a utility statement or something from the county. He'd gotten 3 lines in and stopped, and then started again from the beginning. He'd stood there for a long time after he finished, still in his coat, the mail scattered on the counter around him. The second and third readings happened that same evening, at the kitchen table, with his glasses on and the overhead light because the afternoon had gone while he wasn't paying attention. He read it slowly both times, the way you read something when you're trying to make sure you're understanding it correctly and not projecting what you expect onto what's actually there. The fourth reading was a week later, on a Sunday morning, because he'd found himself thinking about it at odd moments, while he was in the garden, while he was watching the news, while he was trying to sleep, and he wanted to make sure his memory of it matched the actual words. It did. The letter was handwritten, which he'd noticed immediately. 4 pages, on plain cream-colored stationery, in a hand that was precise without being formal. The writing of someone who was accustomed to communicating carefully, but had chosen not to hide behind that precision here. She'd introduced herself by name and by the afternoon she was writing about, which she'd described with a specificity that told him she'd been carrying the memory intact for a long time. The county road, the late afternoon light, the make and color of her car, what the problem had turned out to be. She'd even remembered that his truck had been muddy, which was the kind of detail you only hold on to when something matters to you. She'd written, "I've looked for you, on and off, over the years. I had a first name and a general location and not much else. And I told myself the practical limits of searching were why I never found you." That was partly true. The other part was that I let myself stay busy, and staying busy is a very effective way to avoid sitting in the discomfort of something you owe but can't easily repay. She'd written about building her company, about the ways that afternoon had stayed with her, not as a specific influence she could point to, but as a texture in her thinking about what people were capable of when they chose to help without calculation. She'd written about how that texture had affected decisions she'd made about who to hire, how to treat the people who worked for her, what she wanted the company to stand for. She hadn't written about Rowan directly, and Elias noticed that. She'd mentioned receiving an application from someone with a familiar last name and wanting to honor it appropriately. She hadn't described the details, hadn't turned his son into a plot point in her accounting. That restraint told Elias something about her. She'd closed the letter simply. "I don't know if you remember that afternoon. I've wondered sometimes if it was unremarkable to you, if you helped enough people along the way that any one instance blurred into the rest. If so, I understand. But I've wanted to say thank you for a long time, and I'm saying it now because I've learned that late is better than never, and never is a very long time." Elias had folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it on the kitchen table, and there it had stayed. He'd thought about calling Rowan immediately. He'd picked up the phone twice in the first week and put it back down, and he'd examined his own reasons for that with the honesty he'd always tried to apply to himself, even when it wasn't comfortable. What he'd found was this: he wanted to think about it first. He wanted to understand what he felt about it before he handed it to his son, because once he handed it to Rowan, it would become Rowan's to carry, and Elias had always been careful about what he put in his son's hands. The afternoon she'd described, he did remember it. Not with the same precision she'd brought to the letter, not the specific details, but the woman herself, young, late 20s, visibly stressed, trying hard not to show it. The car had been a basic economy model with a slow coolant leak that had finally caught up with her on a stretch of road where there wasn't much of anything else. The repair had taken longer than he'd expected because one of the hose clamps was corroded and he'd had to work around it. He remembered being mildly annoyed at the hose clamp, not at the situation. He hadn't thought much about it afterward. That was the honest answer. He hadn't thought much about it at all. It was the kind of thing you did when you could do it, and then you went home. He'd told Rowan once, years later, in a general way, that you helped people when you were able to because you'd want someone to do the same for your kid. He hadn't been describing a philosophy. He'd been describing a reflex. He hadn't known it would mean something that lasted 20 years in someone else's chest. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He told Rowan about the letter on a Saturday in early April, 6 weeks after it arrived. Rowan had come down for the weekend. The promotion had been officially formalized the week before, and Elias had suggested he come down, said he'd make something. He made a braised chicken with vegetables from the garden, the kind of meal that took most of the afternoon and produced more than 2 people could reasonably eat, which was a habit Elias had never broken from the years when the house was fuller. They ate and talked about the Hartwell properties. Rowan had been absorbed in the integration planning for 3 weeks, the expanded portfolio, the team restructuring he was still working through. Elias listened and asked practical questions. How many new techs he was bringing on, what the reporting structure looked like, whether the Friday update system was going to scale. You've been paying attention, Rowan said. You talk about it, Elias said simply. I listen. After the dishes were done and they were at the table with the last of the coffee, Elias got up and went to the counter where the letter had been for 6 weeks. He'd moved it from the table to the counter eventually, next to the cookbooks, which was where he put things that needed to stay visible. And he brought it back and set it in front of Rowan without saying anything. Rowan looked at it. The return address was San Francisco. He looked up at his father. Read it, Elias said. Rowan read it. He read it at the same pace he read everything, carefully, without rushing. And Elias watched his face and saw the specific stillness that came over it, the way his son went quiet and internal when something was affecting him that he hadn't expected. He'd seen that look at his wife's funeral. He'd seen it when Rowan got the letter from Daltrey. He'd learned to let it be what it was. When Rowan finished, he set the letter down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his father. She didn't tell me she'd written to you, he said. No. She hired me. She facilitated me getting hired, and she still wrote this. He wasn't asking. He was working through it. Yes, Elias said. Rowan was quiet. He picked up the letter again and looked at the last paragraph, the one about late being better than never. How long have you had this? He said. 6 weeks, Elias said, without apology or explanation. Rowan looked up at him. You sat on it for 6 weeks. I needed to think about it first. A pause. And? Elias turned his coffee mug on the table. I don't know what I expected gratitude to look like, he said. I never thought about it. That afternoon, it was nothing to me. I mean that plainly, not humbly. It was an ordinary thing to do. I fixed the car and went home and made dinner, and I don't remember what I was thinking about on the drive back. He paused. But it wasn't nothing to her, and that's the part I've been sitting with. Rowan looked at his father for a long moment. She's a serious person, he said. She doesn't do things for effect. I know, the letter reads that way. She's been carrying this for 20 years. I know that too. Elias looked at his hands around the mug. I've been carrying a lot of things for 20 years. I understand something about that. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the late afternoon was softening toward evening, the Central Valley light going gold and flat the way it did at this hour. The tomatoes were starting on the vine along the south fence, just the beginnings of fruit, still small and hard and green. She wants to meet you, Rowan said. He wasn't certain of it. The letter hadn't said so explicitly, but he was. Elias looked at the envelope on the table. I know. Is that something you want? His father was quiet for a long moment. He was 71 years old and had lived a life that had been shaped more by other people's needs than by his own preferences. Not out of martyrdom, but out of a genuine orientation toward the practical demands of the moment. He didn't spend a lot of time thinking about what he wanted. It was sometimes hard for him to locate. I think I owe her the courtesy, he said finally. She wrote a real letter that deserves a real response. He looked at Rowan. Can you arrange it? Yes, Rowan said. I can arrange it. He called Maris on a Monday morning, not through Diana, directly. She'd given him her direct line 3 months into the job, with the characteristically understated explanation that he was managing a significant portfolio and needed to be able to reach the right people without going through channels every time. She picked up on the second ring. Hail. My father received your letter, Rowan said. A pause. Not a long one, but present. I wasn't sure whether he'd tell you. He told me Saturday. How is he? The question surprised him slightly. Its specificity, the fact that it was the first thing she asked. He's well, Rowan said. He has a garden. He's working through a library book he hasn't decided about yet. Something in the silence felt like she was smiling, though he couldn't be certain. He wants to meet, Rowan said. That's what I'm calling about. He didn't say it exactly, but he wanted me to arrange it if it was something you were interested in. Yes, she said, without hesitation, without qualification. Just yes. I'll set something up. Thank you, Rowan. He noticed she'd used his first name. She rarely did. He didn't comment on it. The meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon in May at a restaurant in Fresno that Rowan had chosen because it was quiet at lunch hour and had a corner table that gave you privacy without isolating you in a way that would make a first meeting feel like an event. He'd driven down Wednesday evening and stayed at his father's house. Elias had been, by his standards, mildly anxious. Not visibly, but Rowan had grown up reading the particular adjustments in his father's behavior. The kitchen had been cleaner than usual. The coffee was ground fresh. He'd checked the garden twice in an hour for no particular purpose. "You're nervous," Rowan said Wednesday evening. "I'm not nervous," Elias said. "You checked the garden twice." "The squash needed looking at." "The squash is fine, Dad." Elias made the sound that wasn't quite anything, but meant he heard you and wasn't going to confirm it. Maris drove down herself. Rowan had offered to have a car arranged, and she'd declined without making a thing of it. She arrived at the restaurant 2 minutes early, which told Rowan something he already understood about her, and she was dressed simply, no signals being sent, nothing that announced who she was. Dark jacket, no jewelry except the watch. She looked the same as she always did, which was the appearance of someone who'd stopped performing composed and had just become it. She stood up when Elias came in. Rowan watched his father walk across the restaurant, and he saw Maris watching too, and he saw the moment she recognized something. Not the specific memory of a muddy truck and a corroded hose clamp, but something in the way Elias moved, the unhurried particular economy of a man who'd spent his life being physically useful and carried it in his body even now that he was 71. Elias stopped at the table and looked at her. "Ms. Elowen," he said, "Mr. Hale." She extended her hand and he shook it, and there was a moment between them, brief, specific, the particular weight of two people who had been significant to each other in an asymmetrical and uncompleted way for 20 years, and were now standing in the same room for the first time. "Sit down," Elias said, which was what he said to everyone because he was more comfortable when people were seated and the situation felt domestic rather than formal. They sat. Rowan sat across from both of them and was, for the duration of this particular meeting, not a regional maintenance supervisor, and not a son who'd been through a hard 3 months and come out the other side. He was just a person watching two other people try to locate each other across a gap that time had made complicated. Maris spoke first. "I wasn't sure whether writing was the right thing to do," she said. "I went back and forth about it for longer than I should have." "I'm glad you did," Elias said. He said it plainly. His father had always had the ability to say simple things without making them smaller than they were. "I want to ask you something," Maris said, "and I want you to answer honestly rather than politely." Elias looked at her with the attention he gave most things, complete, unhurried. "All right, do you remember that afternoon?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes, not every detail, but yes." She absorbed that. "I've wondered sometimes if you helped people often enough that it blurred together. That's what I said in the letter." "I helped people when I could," Elias said. "That's true. But I remember you. I remember you were trying hard not to look as worried as you were. I remember thinking it was late in the day to be on that road alone." He paused. "I fixed the car and went home. I didn't think much about it afterward. I want to be honest about that." Maris looked at him steadily. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because I don't want to take credit for something I didn't intend," he said. "I didn't do it because I thought it would matter for 20 years. I did it because it needed doing, and I could do it. That's all it was." A silence. Maris looked at the table for a moment, and Rowan saw something move across her face. Not quite emotion, but its neighbor. "That's exactly what I mean," she said quietly. "That's the part that stayed with me." Elias looked at her with something that was close to puzzlement. "Most people do things because they're calculating something," she said. "Even good things. There's a transaction somewhere, recognition, reciprocity, the feeling of being a good person. I'm not criticizing that. I do it too." She paused. "But you didn't. There was nothing to calculate. You just saw a problem and fixed it and went home. I've spent 20 years building a company, and I've thought about that afternoon more than I've thought about most of the decisions I've made, because it was the clearest example I've ever seen of what it looks like to help without an agenda." The table was quiet. Outside the restaurant, Fresno was doing its afternoon thing, indifferent and warm, the May heat already significant. Elias was looking at his coffee. He turned the mug slowly, the way he always did. I appreciate you saying that, he said finally. I don't know what to do with it exactly, but I appreciate it. Maris almost smiled. You don't have to do anything with it. I just needed to say it to your face. Rowan sat across from them and felt something he didn't immediately have a word for, a kind of ache that wasn't painful, or wasn't only painful, the particular sensation of watching something that has been unfinished for a long time find its ending. He'd known pieces of this story. He'd known his father's general character. He'd known Maris Elowen's professional self and the precise, careful version of warmth she allowed into work relationships. But he hadn't known the 20-year shape of it, hadn't understood, until this table, this afternoon, that there were threads connecting the people in his life that existed before he was part of the story. His father had helped a woman on a road in the Central Valley when she was 26 and frightened and trying to hold herself together. And she'd carried that with her, quietly, into the building of something real. And it had become part of the texture of how she made decisions. And one of those decisions had been to look more carefully at an application that bore a familiar name, and that careful look had given Rowan a room to walk into where his work could be seen for what it was. None of it was magic. None of it was the clean causality of a parable where one good deed produces one proportional reward. It was more tangled and more human than that. A reflex, a memory, a debt that couldn't be quantified, a name on a form, a conference room, 12 minutes of talking about electrical panels. The chain of it was visible only in retrospect, and in retrospect it looked like more than it had felt like in any individual moment. That was, Rowan thought, probably how most things worked. You couldn't see the shape of it while you were living it. They stayed at the table for 2 hours. The conversation moved, the way good conversations between strangers do when the initial weight has been handled, from the specific and charged toward the general and easier. Maris asked Elias about the garden, genuinely, and he told her about the tomatoes and the squash situation and the ongoing problem with squirrels that he'd been losing for 3 years. She laughed at that, a real laugh, shorter than it might have been, but real. Elias asked about the company, about what it looked like now versus what she'd imagined when she started it. She answered with the kind of honesty that Rowan recognized as her actual voice rather than her professional one, talking about what had gone wrong, what she'd been wrong about, the hiring decisions that had cost her. The hardest thing I've learned, she said at one point, is that building something good doesn't protect you from making the same mistakes as everyone else. You can have the right values and still build the wrong systems. You can say you judge people on ability and integrity and still let the wrong measures creep in. She looked at her coffee. Having Rowan's report on those vendor relationships was a very specific lesson in that. Elias glanced at his son. Rowan hadn't told him the details of the Cascade situation. He gave his father a brief summary now. The inaccurate service records, the Folsom unit, the documentation that said one thing while the physical evidence said another. He fixed it, Elias said. Not to Maris exactly, and not quite to Rowan either, just to the table. He documented it, Rowan said. The team did the work. Elias looked at him with the look that was as close to pride as he regularly got. The specific, unsentimental acknowledgement of something done correctly that Rowan had been working toward his entire life without knowing exactly how much he wanted it. Same thing, his father said. Maris was watching this exchange with the attention she gave things that mattered to her. She didn't say anything. Some moments were better left alone. When the check came, Maris reached for it. Elias put his hand on the table in a particular way that wasn't quite stopping her but was a clear statement of intention. I'd like to, he said. She looked at him. You wrote a real letter, he said. You drove down here. Let me buy lunch. A beat. Then she withdrew her hand. All right. He paid. He did it the same way he did everything, without ceremony, without comment. He just paid and put his wallet back and finished his coffee. Outside the restaurant, in the May afternoon, they said goodbye in the way of people who are not quite sure what category they fall into for each other now. Not strangers, not friends exactly, something without a clean name that had been earned through the specific exchange of honesty and time. Maris shook Elias's hand again. She held it for a moment. Thank you, she said, for the original thing and for today. Elias nodded once. Thank you for the letter, he said. It meant something. I wasn't sure what at first, but it did. She drove north. They watched her car leave the parking lot, and then Elias turned and walked toward Rowan's truck with the unhurried pace of a man who has nowhere urgent to be. They drove back to the house without talking much. That was fine. They'd never needed to fill the silence between them, and this particular silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that had something settled in it. The weeks after that meeting had a different quality, not dramatically different, not the way you'd describe if you were trying to make a story of it. Rowan went back to San Francisco and to the Hartwell integration and the expanded portfolio and the 3 new techs he was bringing on, whose capabilities he was still assessing. The work was the same work, with more of it, and he met it the same way he always met work, by showing up and paying attention and writing things down accurately. But something in him had reorganized, not shifted, reorganized, the way a room looks different when you've put things in their right places. He thought about what Maris had said at the table, that having the right values didn't protect you from building the wrong systems, that you could intend one thing and construct another through carelessness or through letting the wrong measures creep in. He thought about Marcus Teal and the schedule that had made corner-cutting easier than honesty. He thought about Danny Reyes writing things up 3 times and getting nowhere, and what that had communicated to Danny about whether the system actually cared about what he knew. He thought about his own management of those situations. Imperfect, somewhat improvised, built on intuition as much as on any framework. He started being more deliberate. He reviewed the Friday updates not just for problems but for patterns in what his techs were noticing and what they weren't. The things they wrote about consistently told him what they valued, and the things they consistently omitted told him something else. He had individual check-ins with each of the 14 techs, and then the 17 with the Hartwell additions, not as performance reviews but as actual conversations. What's the most frustrating part of this job right now? What would make your site easier to manage? What have you been watching that nobody's asked you about yet? The answers were specific and useful in ways that surprised him, not because he hadn't expected his techs to have opinions, but because he hadn't expected the volume and quality of information that had been sitting in the field waiting for someone to ask. Sophia Fan in Oakland had been tracking an emerging issue with the mechanical room drainage in one of the buildings for 4 months. She'd noted it in her Friday updates twice, briefly. He'd caught the second mention and asked her directly, and what she'd described over the next 20 minutes was a developing problem that was still small enough to address inexpensively and would not be small for much longer. He addressed it. He put Sophia in the work order as the identifying technician, which was documentation practice but also a statement about where credit belonged. She sent him a Friday update the following week that ended. The drainage issue is resolved. I'll keep an eye on the adjacent area as discussed. Also flagging the fire suppression inspection for Building C is overdue by 11 days. I've already contacted the vendor to reschedule. He read it and thought, there it is. That was what happened when people believed the system was actually listening. They stopped managing information carefully and started sharing it freely, because sharing it became the behavior that made sense. Sophia had been doing her job all along. Now she was doing it in a way that connected to the larger system instead of disappearing into it. That was the thing nobody told you about leadership when you were starting out. It wasn't about being right. It was about building conditions in which the people around you could be right and have it mean something. His father had done that with one afternoon on a county road, without knowing he was doing it, without any intention beyond the practical. He'd created a condition, a woman reaching her destination when she might not have, arriving at a job she'd been interviewed for, continuing forward. And the consequence of that condition had compounded over 20 years in ways neither of them could have traced or predicted. Rowan wasn't naive enough to think that was always how it worked. He'd seen enough of the world to know that plenty of decent acts produced nothing particular, that good work disappeared into bad systems all the time, that Danny Reyes had spent 3 years writing things up and getting nowhere, and the difference between Danny's situation and Sophia's wasn't Sophia's virtue. It was the presence or absence of a supervisor who was paying attention. Luck was real. Timing was real. The particular chain of circumstances that had put Rowan Hale's name on Maris Elowen's desk was not a system. It was a coincidence with long roots, and it could easily have not happened. He was clear-eyed about that. But the other thing was also true, and he held both things at once the way honest people hold contradictions. That how you treat the ordinary moments matters, even when you can't see the consequence. That showing up correctly in small situations is not a strategy. It doesn't guarantee anything, but it's the only foundation that actually holds. His father had known that at a cellular level, had lived it without articulating it, because Elias Hale was not a man who articulated things, so much as a man who demonstrated them over and over until they became the atmosphere you breathed if you grew up around him. Rowan had grown up around him. He wasn't his father. He was impatient in ways Elias wasn't, sharper at the edges, more likely to have an opinion about something and hold it visibly. He'd made mistakes in the role already. He'd moved too fast on one vendor decision in January and had to back up and run the proper evaluation process, which had cost 3 weeks. He'd misread a conflict between two of the Hartwell techs and let it go longer than he should have before addressing it directly. He was still learning the specific size and shape of this job, and some of the learning was uncomfortable. But he showed up. He paid attention. He wrote things down accurately. That was what he had to offer. It turned out, in the specific context of this company and this role and these people, to be enough. It was a Thursday in June when Maris appeared in the operations center on the 3rd floor. She didn't come down often, not because she was removed from the operational side, but because she trusted the people she'd put in place to run it, which was the actual meaning of that kind of trust. When she did appear, people noticed without making a thing of it, the particular awareness that moves through a floor when someone significant enters it. Rowan was at his desk reviewing the Hartwell HVAC integration timeline when he became aware she was standing next to him. He looked up. "Walk with me," she said. They walked to the end of the floor, to the windows that faced inland, the ones that had a view of the city's mid-rise commercial blocks, and the thin ribbon of the bay visible on the eastern edge. She stood looking out for a moment. He stood beside her and didn't rush it. "How's your father?" she said. "Good. The squash is apparently winning this year." "The squirrels?" "Temporary ceasefire." She looked at the city. "I've been thinking about what he said at lunch, about not wanting to take credit for something he didn't intend." Rowan waited. "I've been running this company for 22 years, she said, and I've been careful about a lot of things. Careful about margins and contracts and risk exposure and capital allocation. I've been less careful sometimes about the things that aren't on a spreadsheet." She paused. "The Cascade situation. That contract existed for 4 years. I had a head of operations who trusted the vendor review process, and a property services director who was managing too many competing priorities to audit it closely, and a previous regional supervisor who was competent but not curious." She turned slightly toward him. "And the problem existed the whole time. Danny Reyes knew something was wrong. He wrote it up." 3 times, Rowan said. 3 times, she said, "and nothing happened until you got there. Which means the system was failing before Cascade was failing, and I didn't know because I wasn't building the conditions for the information to reach me." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since your report." "Yes." "What are you going to do about it?" She looked at him with the expression that was her closest equivalent to amusement, a slight compression at the corners of her eyes, not quite a smile. "I'm already doing it. I promoted you." He looked back out the window. "That fixes one position." "It's a start." She was quiet for a moment. "Your father didn't intend to teach me anything. He just acted correctly in an ordinary moment, and I happened to be paying attention. I've been trying to replicate that. Act correctly in ordinary moments, pay attention, and the honest answer is that I do it inconsistently. I get absorbed in the things that feel urgent, and I let the conditions slip." She paused. "I don't have a solution to that. I'm just describing it accurately." That was the thing about Maris Eloin that Rowan had come to understand over 6 months of working for her. She was more honest about her own limitations than most people at her level allowed themselves to be. And she applied that honesty to problems the way she applied everything, without drama, without performance, as a practical tool for figuring out what to do next. It didn't make her easy to work for. It made her trustworthy. "The Friday update system," he said. She looked at him. "It's a small thing," he said. 1 paragraph a week from each site. But the information it surfaces, it's information that existed before I got here. The techs knew it. It just wasn't moving." He paused. "If you built something like that at a broader level, between regional supervisors and the operational layer, not a report, not a KPI, just a paragraph. What you saw this week that surprised you, what you're watching." Maris was quiet for a moment. "That's a simple idea," she said. "Most useful things are." She looked out the window again. Below them, San Francisco continued its specific motion, purposeful and indifferent simultaneously, a city that didn't care about any individual thing but somehow accumulated all the individual things into a continuous whole. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He knew her well enough by now to know that when she said she'd think about something, she meant it literally. She would actually think about it, thoroughly, and then either implement it or come back with a specific reason why not. She wasn't someone who used thinking as a polite form of dismissal. She straightened slightly, the small shift in posture that meant the conversation was ending and she was moving to the next thing. "Your father," she said. "He said the letter meant something. He wasn't sure what at first, but it did." "Yes," Rowan said. "Does he know why yet? What it meant?" Rowan thought about the kitchen table and the 4 readings, about the 6 weeks of sitting with it before he told his son, about the specific thing Elias had said on the drive home from the restaurant, quietly, looking straight ahead at the road. "I didn't know a person could carry something like that and not make it heavy. She carried it, and it didn't make her hard." "I think so," Rowan said. "He doesn't always have words for it, but yeah." Maris nodded once. It was enough. She walked back through the operations center the way she'd come in, without announcement, without disruption, with the self-contained directness of a woman who had somewhere to be and was going there. The floor adjusted around her passage and then returned to itself. Rowan stood at the window for another moment. He thought about his father in Fresno, in the garden with his hands in the soil and the squash finally yielding something. He thought about a county road in the late afternoon and a car on the shoulder, and a man who'd stopped not because he'd calculated anything, but because the situation was there and he could address it. He thought about 20 years of that afternoon living in someone's chest and shaping decisions she didn't even know it was shaping. He thought about Danny Reyes writing things up, about Sophia Fan and the drainage issue, about Marcus Teal and the condensate drain note that had appeared in a Friday update and told him more about the man's recovery than any formal assessment would have. He thought about what it meant to do honest work without recognition, and whether the recognition mattered, and he kept coming back to the same answer. It mattered to the person doing the work. It mattered because people needed to know the system they were putting their effort into was actually listening, not rewarding every good thing. That was impossible and would be hollow anyway, but listening, registering, letting the information move. His father had never needed that. Elias Hale was wired in a way that let him operate without it, that let him fix the car and drive home, and not wonder what had come of it. Rowan wasn't sure if that was a gift or a gap in his father, and he suspected it was some of both. He knew he wasn't wired the same way. He needed the work to connect. He needed to know the report was read, the drainage issue was fixed, the condensate drain note was seen. That wasn't weakness. It was just the honest architecture of who he was. And maybe that was what he'd been given. Not his father's particular selflessness, which he couldn't replicate anyway, but the version of it he could actually sustain, showing up, paying attention, writing things down correctly, building the conditions for other people's knowledge to reach the places it needed to reach. Doing the ordinary work as if it mattered, because it did, even when no one was tracking the specific consequences. His father's truck had been muddy, and the hose clamp had been corroded, and the afternoon had gone long, and a woman had driven away and gone on to build something real, and 20 years later her company had a regional maintenance supervisor who had learned from the man who taught her something she hadn't known she was learning. None of it was a parable. None of it was clean enough to be a lesson. It was just the actual texture of how things connected across time when people did the ordinary work correctly, imperfectly, incompletely, with the specific limitations of who they were, but correctly. That was all it had ever needed to be. Rowan turned away from the window and went back to his desk. The Hartwell HVAC timeline was open on his tablet, and there was a Friday update from Sophia Fan that had come in while he was standing at the window, and the coffee on his desk had gone cold in the way coffee did when you stopped paying attention to it, and he had a 2 o'clock call with Georgette about the Q3 budget cycle that he hadn't finished preparing for. He put the cold coffee in the microwave and opened the Friday update and started reading. Outside, the bay was flat and bright under the June sun, and somewhere in Fresno a man was in his garden with his hands in the soil, and somewhere on a floor above him a woman was thinking about a paragraph. A simple thing, moving through a system that was learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to listen.